This passage is a slightly tough passage, but it is on human relationships. It's the views of three philosophers on how intimacy confining constraints in a relationship are unfair, are controlling. Right? When you constrain, when you stop people from being intimate with somebody else because you're in relationship with that person, that is unfair and incorrect. So let's quickly read the passage and summarize it. It is a tricky passage, so we'll quickly summarize it and answer as many questions. I will answer all the questions, but in the exam, this is the passage where you may not be able to answer all questions in the given time. All right. Philosopher Justin Clady had recently argued against the moral permissibility of what he calls intimacy confining constraints in a relationship. These are defined as, so what is an intimacy confining constraint? These are categorical restrictions on additional intimate relationships, as in the concept of emotional cheating, when one is in at least one such relationship already. You are in a relationship already, so an intimacy confining constraint is a constraint or a restriction on an additional intimate relationship. You're already in one intimate relationship with one person. This intimacy confining constraint stops you or restricts you from getting into another relationship which is of the same kind of, another similar kind of relationship. Simply put, it is that. In a forthcoming book chapter, Norwegian philosopher, so we've talked about Justin Clardy, Norwegian philosopher Ole Martin Moen, along with his co-author, the nurse and trans activist Alexander Solly, make a similar point. So these Ole Martin and Alexander Solly also make a similar point to Justin Clardy. Consider the following. So now there's an example which makes a theory clear. So always remember, examples help to understand a point. Let's say that two friends, Jack and Jane, both love reading and often get together to discuss literature. Then Jack says to Jane that he thinks discussing literature is their thing, that he will remain friends with her only on the condition that she does not discuss literature with anyone else, and indeed that this rule applies even on days when he is out of town, when he is busy doing other things, or when he just doesn't feel like hanging out or talking with Jane. You get the idea of what's an intimacy confining constraint? They both like reading books, right? So he says, look, we're getting along well because we both like reading. But he is now putting a condition that, look, you should not get into this reading thing with anybody else. Even if you're not reading with me, you should not read with somebody else. That is the constraint he is putting. That's the version of the argument from Moen and Solly. In this case, they remark, it seems clear that Jack's requirements are not okay. They are controlling, they are restricting beyond what is acceptable. Let's say we agree. Okay, I'll say, okay. Importantly, Moen and Solly continue, Jack would not be able to justify this requirement by appealing to the claim that, in fact, Jane only wants to discuss literature with him. So when if you confront Jack, he'll say, listen, that's not a restriction. Jane also doesn't want to read with anybody else. She only wants to read with me. The reason this justification does not work. Now, this justification, according to the author, this justification doesn't work. Why? Insofar as this really is the case, if this is really the case, also the justification doesn't work because the requirement is redundant. The requirement is relevant. You can't read with anyone else. This condition kicks into action only insofar as Jane might, in fact, want to discuss literature with somebody else. So this restriction kicks in the moment Jane wants to read with somebody else, right? The requirement now serves the purpose of discouraging her from doing so. Jane reads with Jack. Jack now tells her, listen, you shouldn't read with anybody else. And he defends himself saying, look, she also doesn't want to read with anybody else. But the authors say that justification is not fair. Why? Because your restriction kicks in only when she wants to. And the fact that you have put such a restriction will discourage her from seeking to read with somebody else. All right. But if exclusivity requirements are not okay in the case of friendships, why are they okay in the case of romantic relationship? So in friendships you don't accept this kind of restrictions. Why are they acceptable in romantic relationships? Well, you might be thinking, because friendships and romantic relationships are different in various ways that justify a different standard, because they both are different. In their respective writings, Clary, Moyne, and Solly address this and other anticipated objections, arguing that despite appearances, the claimed differences between a platonic relationship and a non platonic relationship do not amount to a morally different relevant distinction. And the distinction is not moral, whether the friendship is platonic or non-platonic. That distinction, that friendship is platonic while a romantic relationship may be non-platonic, that according to the authors is irrelevant. No one that can ground a categorical restriction on extra relational intimacy, whether physical or emotional, among romantic partners. So you should not put any kind of categorical restrictions on extra relational intimacy, that may be physical, that may be emotional, among romantic partners. They point out that many forms of sexual interaction do not risk pregnancy. So one of the things that they say, that you should not get into extra relationship, there's a risk of pregnancy and disease and things like that. So they said even that is irrelevant, right? They also urge that the alleged specialness, the special value of a romantic relationship need not be diminished by having other such relationships. Each person and so each relationship is unique. So whether you are in a romantic relationship or an unromantic relationship, there should not be any intimacy restricting constraint. That's what the passage is talking about. Sure, they say, we must be accustomed to thinking of sexual intimacy and fundamentally different from other forms of intimacy, like those we associate with platonic friendship. But cultural constructs can be unlearned. Our culture has made us accept one kind of relationship as being okay and one extra relationship as not okay. Platonic friendships you can have as many, but not necessarily other forms of intimacy. But this is a cultural construct, and cultural constructs can be unlearned. Intimacies of various kinds can be important life goods. We should want our partners, just like our friends, to be as free as possible to pursue what is good for them. You should not put restrictions on your partners on intimacy. They should be free to do whatever they want to, right? Within what they want to pursue. You should not put restrictions on them. So they conclude, demanding monogamy of a partner lest you withdraw your care and affection from them or pull the plug on the whole relationship is an illegitimate exercise of power. It is controlling, according to these philosophers. Monogamy, or demanding monogamy from a partner, demanding that your partner be monogamous, is an illegitimate exercise of power. It can come voluntarily. You should not demand it, right? All right. All of the following can be inferred from the passage except that. That means which one option cannot be inferred from the passage. In their book, Moyne and Solly argue by analogy. Yes, the example of Jack and Jane. So, what's an analogy? An example, a comparison, giving an example which compares. So, he talks about, he explains the rule through analogy. So, A is correct. Friendship and romantic relationships are not the same. He says, why would you accept, uh, why would why restrictions are not acceptable in friendships? Why are they acceptable in romantic relationships? He said you might argue that friendships and romantic relationships are different, therefore constraints work in one and don't work in one. And his argument is, yes, they may be different, but at the basis constraints are unfair in both, right? So friendships and romantic relationships are not the same, he agrees, and then explains that even in that case, even in a romantic relationship, these kind of constraints, intimacy confining constraints, are not fair, right? While being in a relationship, it's possible that a person enters into an additional intimate relationship that is platonic. He talks, right, he says getting into a platonic relationship is not cheating or something like that. Oh, he has mentioned exclusivity requirements not okay in friendships. Okay, all right. The second last paragraph, he says, we may be accustomed to thinking of sexual intimacy as fundamentally different from other forms of intimacy, like those we associate with platonic friendships. So, one can, intimacies of various kinds are possible. You can have one kind of intimacy with one person and platonic friendship with another. Therefore, option, restrictions are needed but only to a certain extent in a relationship. The author believes that you don't need any kind of restrictions. Therefore, D is the correct answer. He does not say that you need restrictions in a relationship. None of the philosophers who were discussed have agreed to any form of restrictions in a relationship. Therefore, D is the correct answer.